Well, for years, Duluth has carried a bad reputation when it comes to investigations into sexual assaults. Back in 2015, a BCA audit showed the city had the highest number of sexual assault kits sitting on evidence shelves that were never sent to the crime lab for DNA testing.
Now, the old kits, some dating back to 1993, have now been tested thanks to a federal grant. And tonight we're taking a closer look at what's happening now and the reasons that hundreds of kits were never submitted in the first place. To do this, we are telling you the story of one of those victims, a 15-year-old girl whose rapist wasn't brought to justice until 7 years after the crime. We have to warn you, this story may be upsetting to some.
The year was 2010 in Duluth, when in the dark, a 15-year-old teenage girl and her friend made their way through downtown Duluth on foot after running away from Woodland Hills, a juvenile justice facility. Looking for a phone to call for a ride home, the girls ran into a man who offered them a cigarette and invited them inside to warm up. Once inside, they met another man named Kurt, and both men talked about what would happen next, announcing to the girls which ones the men would have before separating them. Once alone with the man who called himself Kurt, the victim said he scooted close and began to kiss her face and neck. She told him no, and she did not want to do this. But Kurt pushed her back into the couch and laid on top of her and forced intercourse. The teenager reported the crime to staff at Woodland Hills. She wanted to pursue charges, so she completed the medical testing for a sexual assault DNA kit at St. Mary's. In a 2010 interview with the Duluth police investigator, she reported what happened, even a general location, a few blocks up the road from the cozy apartments, side-by-side duplex, door on the right. Now, 7 years later, we sat down with current Duluth Police Chief Mike Tuskin to review the case file.
Tell me kind of what happened after that.
Well, we, of course, commenced an investigation into the sexual assault, and then ultimately we reached a point where we didn't have any further information that we could follow up on, and the case just kind of rendered itself suspended at that point.
This victim, in all fairness, did say the location of the crime, too. What can you tell me about what's in the case files at this point, about what kind of investigation occurred?
If you have a location, there's opportunity for you to do follow-up, certainly at the location, to try to determine who may have lived there. We don't have records that would show that there was a canvass that's done. It's not uncommon for us to go on door knocking in a neighborhood called a canvass to try to figure out who was potentially there, who maybe lived in the residence.
So basically no paperwork in here that says that an investigator went to go knock on the door.
Right.
Tuskin, who has never personally worked on this case, says that's when the investigation was suspended. And this is where the DNA in the 15-year-old sexual assault kit sat on police shelves from 2010 to 2016.
You have a first name, a general location, but everything else of the investigation stops. Was there any desire to send the kit that was completed, the DNA kit that the victim submitted in for testing?
Yeah, so our organization, as a rule, when we didn't have a named suspect, we did not submit kits in that time frame to the BCA for testing. While a first name can be helpful in some investigations, and other times it didn't lead us to an identity, didn't necessarily lead us to a logical next step for the investigation, so after running out of leads, the investigation was suspended.
An explanation that Jude Foster of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault says doesn't make much sense.
I don't think that that's common. I know I was a sexual assault advocate doing direct services in Hennepin, Scott, and Carver County for, 13 years, and that certainly wasn't true. We had a much higher rate of stranger rapes where we didn't know a first or last name. But yeah, that was surprising to me.
So it's unlikely that other major cities in Minnesota were following that same formula?
I don't believe they were.
In 2015, Duluth was identified as the police department in Minnesota holding on to the highest number of untested kits, nearly 600. And almost all of those, 454, the victims did file a police report and wanted to pursue charges. But their kits never left the evidence room to get DNA testing. Foster believes there's a reason why cases like this one didn't get sent in.
It definitely comes down to bias, right? We all have implicit bias, and law enforcement is not excluded from that. I think that this would have been a really difficult case because we're talking about a young person, we're talking about a Native youth, and we're talking about a youth that was involved with the criminal justice system. So I think already there's bias there, right?
Wouldn't that be illegal no matter what to have sexual contact with a 15-year-old if you're well over the age? So how much jury convincing would really need to happen if there was DNA evidence?
Right, and I think it's, they might not have believed the victim.
Is it possible that there's several more cases just like this one?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
That's where the Psaki grant comes in. Over the course of 3 years, Duluth has received $2 million from the federal government to pay for a partnership and staffing for PAVSA, Duluth Police, and the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office to get through that large accumulation of kits. The grant also allows financial support for the Minnesota BCA to transition to the direct-to-DNA testing method, a method Chief Mike Tuskin asked the BCA to adopt so they could get through the tested kits faster. The grant meant all Duluth kids got sent in for testing, including the 15-year-old victim's kit from 2010, which found a hit. The DNA of 43-year-old Curtis Guy Marcula, who would have been 36 when he sexually assaulted the 15-year-old. His DNA was already in the system even before the reported assault happened, and he was already behind bars on other charges. In fact, he was a familiar face to Duluth police. They featured him as their property crimes wanted person of the week back in 2014 for probation violations. All of that attention gave them a tip to his whereabouts then, and he's been in prison since. When confronted with this sexual assault case, he pled guilty to fourth-degree criminal sexual conduct and was sentenced to additional time in prison.
The sexual assault was reported in 2010. If you take a look at his record, he's got a burglary conviction, a sale of controlled substance charge, a DWI conviction, and then a domestic assault conviction. Those all happened after the time the crime was reported. Right. So do you feel maybe some of this didn't need to happen?
Yeah, without question. And so, yeah, you oftentimes have people who are predatory in nature. Aren't crime specialists, if you will. They are involved in criminal activity, and it often is a spectrum of criminal activity. It is part of the reason that these cases are so important, so that if you hold someone accountable, they get the treatment they need, or they get put into corrections, that they are no longer going to be a threat to public safety.
Through our investigation, we discovered just how many cases potentially could end up solvable. In fact, there are a lot of DNA matches.
I'm pleasantly surprised that they got as many hits as they've gotten.
As of the 1st of this month, 203 DNA profiles have been detected. Of those, 114, more than half, match people who are already in the system. Investigators believe it's likely that number will increase. There is no statute of limitations for these cases, and so far, with the new DNA results, Duluth police have been able to send 17 cases to the prosecutor's office for charges. But 5, which is about 30% of those cases, St. Louis County has chosen not to prosecute.
And what that means is, when we apply the standard, it means that we do not believe that there is a reasonable likelihood of success at trial. It could mean that we needed more evidence, or it could mean that all the evidence that we have could be about as good as we could get, and still there is a question of whether or not we could be successful at trial.
Is it disappointing for detectives if one of the cases that they forward to the prosecutor doesn't get picked up?
Yeah, I think it always is. I think that police work, oftentimes you do have some type A personalities that are in this work. They do the best they can. They put a lot of time and effort into the cases. They know the victims, but yet at the same time, we work within a system, all of us, and so ultimately, sometimes the facts of that case are stronger than others, and sometimes it's a more viable case than others. Not to say that it didn't happen, but can you prove it?
With a large amount of DNA matches coming in weekly, it is crunch time. Both investigators and prosecutors have a lot of work to bring justice to cases, sometimes decades old.
It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest with you. We've had so many positive results that give us good, strong evidence to proceed with cases, but we're challenged with a lack of resources still. That will always be a problem. There are limited resources.
And now police and prosecutors are tasked with rebuilding trust.
Certainly legislation now today and our policies and practices are more restrictive than legislation. That we learn from it and we're better for it and we'll be better moving forward.
But at the end of the day, Chief Mike Tuskin says all of the testing and resources cannot solve a bigger issue.
And that we build better young men so that they are aware of that they are not better than or superior to women, and that there is just a genuine mutual respect and admiration for women. That will change our culture and some of the way that women are treated.
And it is now law in Minnesota for current kits to be submitted for DNA testing within 60 days. Duluth is aiming to have them done within 30 days. And the new law also allows victims to track the progress of their kits at all stages of the process. And it's important to know, if you reported a sexual assault before 2015 in Duluth and your kit has now been sent in, and there are a team of people in the area who want to help you seek justice through the Psaki grant. And at this point, Duluth has connected with 74 of those reported assault victim survivors. If you would like to contact them, the information is on your screen. We're also going to have that on our website.